So this is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Neofinalism. We're picking up from page 73 of the translation. So we're in the chapter Signification of Equipotentiality. And so I think we started this chapter last week, if I remember correctly. Yeah, it's a relatively short chapter. And so this concept of equipotentiality is one of his sort of key concepts, which he's drawing from embryology primarily. So as we've discussed, throughout our reading, in early 20th century embryology, there was this discovery that in many cases you can obviously it depends on the particular species that you're studying, but in many cases you can take an early embryo, so an early at an early stage of development, and you can do all kinds of interventions on this embryo. Cut it in half, or take a piece from the left side and swap it with a piece on the right side, etc. Do all these things, and the outcome is like a more or less normal looking embryo. So like the ones where you cut it in half, you don't get half of the embryo develop into a left half of a tadpole or something. You just get two small tadpoles. And this kind of thing even happens, outside of a laboratory, just in actual biological operations when identical twins in humans, for example, are a result of an embryo splitting early on, and then each of the sort of halves of this embryo develops into obviously a normal-looking human, not like a left half or a top half of a human. And then again, so like you can take the embryo maybe at a little bit later stage, and you can like once there's a sort of left and right division, and then you can take a section of that embryo that is from the left side and move it to the right, and then do the same thing from the right to the left, and instead of having like a left leg grow on the right side and vice versa, the piece that was a leg on the left is now a leg on the right. It forms a right leg. So it's sort of developing in accordance with where it now is rather than where it came from. And so this concept of equipotentiality sort of expresses the fact that this portion of the embryo is not sort of like predetermined to become a left leg. It has the potential to become, say, a left leg or a right leg. And then this sort of development it sort of proceeds in a kind of like a cascade of like more and more determined sort of properties of this region. So like at the very beginning, the embryo is more or less undifferentiated, and then it different regions become sort of more specialized. Like you'll have like a left and right differentiation, a head and tail differentiation, and then from left and right, then you might get like left leg versus left arm, and then so each of these regions becomes sort of more and more specialized, and there's a kind of irreversibility in this cascade of determination, in the sense that once this region has sort of decided to become a leg, you might be able to swap it with the leg on the opposite side and get a normal, get the right leg side, but you can't necessarily swap it with an arm, for example. The leg arm differentiation might happen before the left leg versus right leg differentiation, for example. There's this sort of complicated cascade of differentiation, but before one of these sort of branch points where this region decides that it's going to become an arm versus a leg, before that point it has this equipotentiality, in the sense that it could become either an arm or a leg depending on where it is situated in relation to the rest of the embryo. And as Angus points out in the chat here, we can sort of describe, or we can make an analogy of the development of the embryo, this equipotentiality in development, with detours in sort of navigating a maze or a real life landscape that most of us have like a sort of largely sort of standard route that we use to get to, I don't know, work or the grocery store or whatever places we have to go. But if for whatever reason you can't use that route, if there's construction or a traffic jam or whatever, you have to sort of improvise. Most of the time you can figure out, okay, now I can't take the the road that I usually use, so I have to go a different direction and then come back. Have to go north for a bit and then come back south or whatever. Yeah, so the sort of like detour still gets you to where you wanted to go, even though the route in between is different than it would normally be. And likewise with the embryo, I mean, normally the embryo in development doesn't have like this intervention that swaps the left and right sides. But if that does happen, it's still capable of developing into a sort of normal looking tadpole, assuming that this swapping happens early enough in the developmental process. And so this concept comes from embryology, as I've been describing, but for Ruyer, it's sort of like he's sort of generalizing this concept to any kind of process in which there is this kind of semantic sensitivity, I guess you could. It's maybe not a very good way of describing it, but the sort of responsiveness to the realm of themes or forms, and that he's talking about here. So the embryo develops towards a certain structure of a a tadpole or whatever it is, regardless of the sort of disruptions of its normal process. In the same way as the person trying to get to the grocery store is sort of directed, directs their actions in such a way as to reach the grocery store despite obstacles or unforeseen circumstances that come up along the way. And of course, these aren't sort of flawless or completely immune to any kind of disruption. There are interventions that are too great for the embryo to deal with, or if the whole city is like under martial law or whatever, you might not be able to get to the grocery store despite your best detour abilities. But anyway, yeah, there's a large extent to which you can adapt to unforeseen circumstances, and so this kind of adaptation to achieve a certain goal or to respond to a certain theme, despite different sort of contingent obstacles or unforeseen events. That's what he's sort of taking as like characteristic of this realm of true forms that respond to this like these themes or values. Okay, so we can pick up from I lost where we were again. Pick up from page 73 at these three facts, please.
Great. These three facts are perfectly equivalent. In each case, it is a matter of the passage from one domain of equipotential survey to another. 1. Either from one embryonic area to another. 2. Or from the organic domain to the psychological domain, instinct, parentheses. 3. Or from a mnemic sphere, closed onto itself, to the quote-unquote I consciousness. In the evolution of species, the nervous system is at the primitive stage very rudimentary, and it is rightly concluded that the psyche in the ordinary sense of the term, i.e. consciousness turned toward adaptation to the external world, must be equally rudimentary. Whether one is or is not a strict behaviorist, little matters here. Animal psychology finds that the development of behavior and of the psyche follows quite faithfully the development of the nervous system. But the common error consists in extrapolating rashly and in believing that where a nervous system is lacking, a consciousness must also be lacking. The second consciousness, i.e. turned toward the external world, of an annelid or an echinoderm, must be undeniably more vague than that of a rat, a monkey, or a man. But if the absence of every nervous system corresponds to the absence of every secondary consciousness, it does not necessarily correspond to the absence of primary consciousness, which is tied directly to the organic form and not to the form of the nervous system. Nor does it further imply the vague character of this primary consciousness. If, by going from man or chimpanzee to annelid, we go from a precise secondary consciousness to a vague consciousness, nothing allows us to assert that by moving from echinoderm to protozoan or to plant, we move to an even more vague consciousness, epsilon if not zero. On the contrary, the facts imply that we continue to find a consciousness of another kind, primary and perfectly clear and precise in its kind, albeit turned toward biological organization and not toward the world. An infant who has just been born has only a confused consciousness of the external world. This consciousness quickly takes shape as he ages. By retroactive extrapolation, we have a tendency to believe that before the moment of birth, this consciousness was non-existent or evanescent, and yet the embryo is capable of thematic behavior. It is therefore more logical to assume that the embryo had a consciousness of a different nature, with a different content, but as subtle and complex as its behavior can imply, which is saying a good deal. We do not know how to go about persuading our reader, if he had the patience to follow us, that we do not inject this thesis with any fantasy or any metaphorical vagueness. Like all half-truths, panpsychism has done more harm than good. It is panpsychism, more than behaviorism, that prevents us from defining primary organic consciousness clearly and precisely, because it quote-unquote fills the place with a secondary consciousness in the infinitesimal or diluted state. The harm can be traced back to Leibniz and his quote-unquote tiny perceptions. Understood in this sense, panpsychism is as false as the psychobiological order, in the psychobiological order, as would be in physiology a thesis that, having vaguely glimpsed the fact that assimilation and respiration are cellular and not merely macroorganic phenomena, concluded that there has to be in each cell tiny stomachs and tiny lungs. Whereupon biologists, failing to locate these tiny stomachs and lungs, would be tempted to deny every cellular assimilation and respiration. The facts of equipotentiality should set us once again on the right track. Equipotentiality is the objective functional aspect that a particular mode of reality assumes for an observer, a consciousness, that is, as we shall soon see, an absolute form, an absolute self-surveying domain. As the assembled and interconnected structures of a machine are the sign of a consciousness that was once applied to this assemblage and represent, so to speak, fossil finality, so equipotentiality is the sign of an actual consciousness. The adult equipped with a brain was at first an embryo without a neural plate. The embryo's primary consciousness is therefore primary from all points of view relative to the consciousness that is turned toward the world. The quote-unquote I consciousness, as a domain, derives from the domain of embryonic consciousness. If we want to grasp the facts, we have to become used to dissociating consciousness and brain, and to associating consciousness and organic form. The brain is not an instrument for becoming conscious, intelligent, inventive, or reminiscent. Consciousness, intelligence, invention, memory, and active finality are tied to the organic form in general. The brain's quote-unquote superiority, or its distinctive character, is that it is an incomplete organ, an always open network, which thus retains equipotentiality, the active embryonic consciousness, and applies it to the organization of the world. It remains for us to study more closely the content of the intimate relation between organic form and consciousness. For if we have noted how everything leads back to this close relation, which certainly contains one of the most pivotal secrets of finalist action, we have not yet tackled the problem in itself. So this relates to what we discussed in the last session, where he argued that organs themselves, human organs, have a kind of equipotentiality, and that equipotentiality is a kind of clear consciousness, I guess, of some kind. So that the heart has it's not a heart is I guess maybe what he's saying is that the heart shouldn't be understood as like a confused brain-like consciousness, but as a clear heart-like consciousness, whatever that would be like. And that the same is true of embryonic primary consciousness, that it isn't a confused secondary consciousness, but a different modality, I guess, of primary consciousness. And that an interesting point he made here that kind of helped me understand what he means by equipotentiality is that equipotentiality is how a primary consciousness appears to another consciousness or an observer. So this sort of task-oriented, precise task-oriented action that can kind of overcome obstacles or distractions and reach its goal is the form that some primary consciousness takes for scientist or somebody else who's observing it.
Yeah, I think this passage that we just read is very important. There's like a lot of his sort of key concepts are brought together here. So maybe we started on that last point you brought up about the role of equipotentiality as sort of a sign, as he puts it, a sign of this sort of primary consciousness. So like one of the sort of recurring questions in like animal behavior studies in ethology is like, to what extent can we attribute to animals a sort of full or like high level directedness towards a goal, as opposed to a kind of like simplistic sort of response to a certain signal. So like yeah, so often like there are of course these classic rat navigation kind of experiments, like can the rat figure out how to navigate this maze to get to the food source or whatever it is. And there's like a million different variations on this experiment, and you're essentially trying to figure out, is the rat just sort of like learning that like this visual perception, when I see this sort of arrangement of walls, then I turn left, and then when I see this other arrangement of walls, I turn right. And just sort of learning these like very simple cues, and then sort of using that, and then sort of those cues are just associated with the way the maze is set up, and then it is able to get to the food. Of course, the results of a lot of these experiments show that the rat is not just sort of very directly responding to these visual cues or any other sort of sensory cues. It does actually sort of grasp to some extent the layout of the maze, and then if you make if you block the path that it usually takes, it is able to take a sort of rational detour that gets it to the food source in a different way. And it's precisely insofar as we attribute that rationality to the detour behavior, like if the rat just sort of finds its path blocked and then goes back to the starting point and sits there and waits, we would say, okay, the rat doesn't really understand the maze or the layout of the maze. Or if it found its path blocked and then just sort of randomly moved around in different directions until it eventually found just by chance the path to the food source, we would say, okay, it doesn't really understand the layout of the maze. It's just sort of happened to find the right way to get there. But when we can see that the actions of the rat to get around that obstacle are rational or are like effective at reaching the goal despite the obstacle, that's when we sort of attribute to the rat an understanding of the layout of the maze, as opposed to just like this very simplistic sort of response to sensory cues, or just sort of like random exploration until it finds the right path. And this is sort of like a general. This isn't sort of restricted to rats navigating a maze, but in any, like in the case of the embryo, for example, we could imagine that the development of the embryo was a sort of like fixed mechanical program that, like, okay, this event sort of triggers the next event in the developmental process, and then like each one is sort of built into the previous one. But if this were the case, then taking the left section, taking a section off the left part of the embryo and putting it on the right side, should lead to that the former left embryo section developing into a left leg, even though it's now on the right side. And of course that's not that's not what we observe. Of course, if you're doing that intervention early enough, as we discussed. And so the fact that the embryo is sort of responding rationally, if you want to put it that way, and making sure that the leg region develops into a right leg now that it's on the right side, as opposed to a left leg, which is where it came from. So this kind of like achieving a goal despite obstacles in a rational way is how we sort of attribute some kind of finality or goal directedness to that to the developmental process of the embryo, and it's what we sort of take as the indication that the embryo is not just a sort of machine that is where each step is sort of built in, sort of pre-built or pre-programmed in the previous step, and then the sort of step or the the further I guess generalization that Ruyer is making here is that this is kind of so in the case of the person or even the rat, who is capable of grasping the sort of layout of the world around them to reach the goal despite obstacles. We attribute this grasp to a kind of awareness, or yeah, an understanding of some kind. Um, and he's saying, well, if we attribute this understanding to the person and the rat, why would we not attribute this same understanding to the embryo that is, doing something similar, not navigating a maze, of course, but navigating the sort of I don't know, configuration space or something of potential paths towards a tadpole. And when there's an obstacle to its normal path that it would take to becoming a tadpole, it is taking a sensible detour to produce a normal looking tadpole, despite the left and right leg regions being swapped. And so this sort of awareness or understanding that is capable of adjusting and achieving a goal despite obstacles, I think is sort of what he's describing here as primary consciousness. I'm not sure that's maybe the best term to use here. I think he's maybe making things more difficult for himself by sort of using the same word consciousness and then sort of qualifying it as primary versus secondary. But yeah, so it's this grasp of how to respond appropriately to reach a certain goal despite obstacles. Like what are the possibilities? What is what is a better and a worse way to reach that goal, despite given the layout of the world and the situation of that entity. But yeah, and then he wants to sort of counter this sort of temptation, I guess, to treat primary consciousness as like a sort of lower grade or like a vaguer or more obscure version of secondary consciousness. So like when we use the word consciousness, we're thinking of the sort of eye level consciousness where I as a person am aware of the world around me and to some extent of my own state, so I can feel in some obscure way like what my mood is, or whether I'm tired or energized, or yeah, you have a sort of sense of yourself, as well as of the world around you. But this is a kind of secondary consciousness, because your awareness of yourself is not a sort of immediate awareness. You're sort of like when you're, I guess, assessing whether you're tired or not, you are sort of like almost sort of like stepping back from yourself and looking at yourself. Like you sort of look, okay, do I have this like burning feeling in my eyes? Like I feel like I need to close my eyes, and then you sort of use that as a sign of tiredness. So you're almost, it's almost the same. I mean, you're using different sort of sources of information, but you can also look at another person and assess whether they're tired. You can see the way they're behaving and so on, and say, okay, this person is tired. And you're doing something similar in relation to yourself, even though of course you have different sources of information, like the feeling in your eyes and whatever, but you're still sort of like using information to attribute a state to yourself rather than having that immediate grasp of that state. And of course, many of the states of our body are not things that we have very good awareness of. So like if you're assessing how drunk you are, that is not something that you're very good at doing, precisely because being drunk makes it harder for you to evaluate your own states. So you might feel like, oh, I'm everything's fine. I'm actually better. My faculties are better than they are when I'm sober. But of course that is not the case. But yeah, so like your sort of capacity to assess your own state is a sort of secondary capacity that you're sort of using signs to infer what your state is, as opposed to your heart is not sort of inferring what its own states are. It just sort of has this immediate access to what it's doing. And then so yeah, the temptation here is to sort of treat the heart's primary consciousness, or this sort of responsiveness of the heart to its I guess capacities, is sort of to treat this as like a more obscure version of our own awareness of ourselves, at that eye level. And Ruyer points out that there's really no reason to assume that this is the case. Yeah, so like the fact that a heart is not aware of the same kinds of things as a person is aware, doesn't really give us any reason to like put them on sort of a scale of like clear versus obscure and say the heart must be lower on the scale than the person. Yeah, they're just doing different kinds of things, and there's no sort of good reason to assume that they sort of fit on a scale in that sense, and that one is sort of higher than the other. Yeah, and so I think this is yeah. This is why he sort of described why he's distinguishing what he's doing from panpsychism, because he takes panpsychism to be a position that would sort of attribute something like our secondary consciousness, so our sort of like grasp of ourselves at the person level, um, attributing this to other entities, but like in a less a lower degree or a more obscure form. And this is what he is denying. So this is not what he's doing. But yeah, so he's attributing primary consciousness to all these other entities, but not just a sort of lesser degree of secondary consciousness.
Yeah, I think his contrast to panpsychism is important there. That he's you know like commonly panpsychism kind of just dilutes consciousness to this vague entity that is used to kind of explain everything. And the key to his is that is that it's his consciousness is very specific, has that sense activity, that goal directed work, and I think that that's the key, so that he can sort of ascribe it to a wider range of things than we commonly would, but not quite go to that panpsychic level. I mean, his consciousness is very specific. I mean, exactly as you have been saying. It's defined by its activity, its goal directed work. That it has some value to which it works, and that it can adapt to potential barriers that may come along the way, to some degree. So I also, though, I think for me it's important here because as I read a lot of this, I can see where at one point, had I read this maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where I would have just dismissed so much of what he's saying here. For instance, this embryonic activity, or when he talks about cellular respiration, and that we can't just put little tiny stomachs there, tiny lungs. And I would say, oh, well, this is easy. This is the Krebs cycle. I mean, we understand how the mitochondria works or something. And so, but then kind of as he points out, that still leads to something of an infinite regress, because you still have to explain. I mean, if this is just an empty chemical chain reaction, that just happens for no reason, it's just kind of like, oh, it was probably going to happen. You needed this, and you remove any goal directed or senseful activity to it. If you're really being honest about that, you still have to explain another level, and you get stuck in that infinite regress. Whereas with his, kind of neo-finalist framing of all of this, you now can place it within that. I don't know how quite to describe it, like a circular teleology. I don't know if that's the right term, but it's functioning for its own goals. And really, especially considering it like that, if you were to dismiss these, what he calls organic consciousness or embryonic consciousness, as just some genetic or chemical programming, you would also sort of have to dismiss what he calls here our I consciousness, our consciousness that's directed towards the external environment, with the same way, and just say, well, it's just that. And some people might want to do that, but then if you do that, it's easy to get stuck in what he talks about as this kind of fossilized activity, because that doesn't allow for any creativity, any openness to activity. So there would be no kind of progression to anything. It would just get stuck and fossilized. So that's what I really take from this chapter, which this chapter for me was where this book really hits. and
Yeah, he makes an
opens
interesting
up.
point in I think it might have been the last chapter about how if you try to sort of explain consciousness, you end up kind of explaining too much. Like if you say, oh, this sort of arrangement of biochemical events, this hormone and this neurotransmitter and all these things happen, then you kind of like if you have an explanation of everything that's going on, like you have like I don't know a biochemical explanation of a person writing a poem or whatever, then you sort of like it then there's sort of like a I don't know unnecessary quality to the actual consciousness of the person involved in writing that poem. It's kind of a what is it the like the sounds that the train is making sort of as an accompaniment of the train, but it doesn't have any like involvement in the actual sort of functioning of the train as a machine. So if you sort of like explain everything in terms of these sort of in this mechanical terms in as a machine, even though of course it's a biochemical machine and not a sort of mechanical machine in the strict sense. If you explain everything, then you're sort of making consciousness into this epiphenomenon that just sort of like accompanies the biochemical machine and doesn't have any actual role in the process. And yeah, so it seems very strange to sort of suppose that like there are all these events going on, these physical events going on, and then just for no reason, for no like there's no actual role, but some of these events are also accompanied by this like I don't know what we call experience of those events. Yeah, it seems like a very strange account of the world that there's just this sort of like ghostly accompaniment to some of these events that has no actual role in those events themselves. And so yeah, you sort of by trying to sort of explain these phenomena, you sort of explain too much, and then once you sort of recognize that, and then you sort of want to ensure that the sort of experiential aspect of say writing a poem is actually a part of the story of the causal explanation of the poem writing process, then there's no sort of like split or a line that you can draw in that poem writing process, and you can say this side of the line is the sort of consciousness side where you have an I that is responding to aesthetic values of like what is a better poem and a worse poem, etc. And then this other side of the line is the potassium pumps inside the neurons that are doing these operations and whatever. It's this sort of biochemical side, and then somehow these two sides come together, maybe in the pineal gland if you're Descartes, and bring about the poem writing process that putting the actual words on paper or whatever. Yeah, there's no sort of line you can draw in the middle of this process and say one side is this sort of goal directed or directed to these themes or values, like a nice poem or a good poem or whatever. And then this other side is just this sort of machine side, this biochemical machine side, and then you have to sort of treat the whole process as sort of at every level, or the whole poem writing process is this biochemical process that is at the same time directed towards values, and that has this sort of finalistic character. And so I think that's sort of like the sort of very high level or like the big picture presentation of his sort of argument against this kind of split between the machine and the goal directedness. Yeah, you can't sort of split the process into these two halves and then try to figure out how to put them together again afterwards.
Yeah, for me, I mean, it really boils down to where is the creative potential in your explanation, and his provides that versus these other explanations. And then maybe someone would jump in and say, well, AI can be creative. Well, but who is the judge of this creativity? Like what is creativity in AI? It's still a human activity, as through the function of this machine. Yeah. Yeah, really cool chapter.
Yeah, I mean that sort of connects back to our the previous reading that we did, the cybernetics book from Ruyer, and of course he's talking about very different technologies in the 1950s and in the 1960s than the kinds of things that we have today. But a lot of the sort of I guess questions about what exactly the technology is doing when it's sort of simulating or seemingly simulating a human problem solving behavior. So the kinds of machines he was talking about were like you know machines that can recognize a letter, for example, in an image. And of course, this is much better now. We have pretty good optical character recognition software, although not. I mean, it still makes a fair amount of mistakes. The ones that you get sort of built into PDF software, but yeah, it's still obviously much better than what was available in the 50s and 60s. And yeah, so the question is like, should we treat this as sort of just a simulation of human sort of cognitive abilities? It is just sort of producing the same results even though it's doing something very different, or should we treat this as given that a machine is capable of doing this using this like sort of mechanical process in the very broad sense of mechanical, it's just sort of like a state that is proceeding to a second state based on a certain rule. Should we treat that as like evidence that the human capacity to say recognize letters is itself mechanical? It is something that is a state that is proceeding to a second state based on a rule or a set of constraints or whatever. Yeah, and so of course there are. So he points out that there are processes that human cognitive abilities that we can sort of treat as mechanical. So our capacity to recognize letters is in some sense mechanical, but this precisely is the result of sort of building machines within ourselves. So that we, when you sort of train a child to be able to recognize letters, that child sort of like builds a machine within themselves that is capable of learning letters. But there's still that equipotentiality in the sense that the child could have been trained to recognize some other set of shapes, or to do various other things. And I mentioned, I think a few weeks ago, that like there's a sort of weird phenomenon in like neuroscience in the sense that humans who have undergone that reading training, that like have learned how to read whatever the writing system that is in use in their area, in their sort of region where they grew up, regularly have one specific area that is sort of especially active when reading, and you could sort of like naively take this to be like evidence that there's a sort of reading module, that this region is like specialized for reading. But of course we know that writing has only been around for 5,000-6,000 years or so, and this is far too short for the brain to have human brains to have evolved a reading a specialized reading region or something like that. So this region presumably whatever properties this region has evolved for various other reasons, or it could even just be sort of like a evolutionary accident that it has these properties as a result of other regions specializing in other things, etc. But for whatever reason, humans developed in such a way that this region of the brain regularly has these properties, and then for many hundreds of thousands of years this region was doing other things presumably, and then at some point someone it happened independently in different places, people developed systems of using visually recognizable marks as a way of sort of reflecting linguistic signs, and as a result of this invention or discovery or whatever, this region came to be sort of specialized for reading, but it clearly it had this equipotentiality. It could have been used for various other purposes, and presumably was long before writing was invented. Yes, all of this is to say that the sort of equipotentiality aspect is always there in a way that it sort of is prior to the sort of formation of these sort of internal machines, these cognitive machines that so the child learns to recognize letters and to read words and so on. and then at the at the end of this process, the child has this sort of cognitive machine within themselves to recognize letters, which in some sense is similar to the optical character recognition machine that we can build our or get our computers to execute. But the equipotentiality that would sort of allow that child to, I don't know, learn some bizarre other system that no person has ever invented or thought of. Yeah, that equipotentiality is something quite different from a machine that proceeds from one state to the next according to a rule.
Yeah, the point he made about equipotentiality being kind of the observable form of primary consciousness, it made me wonder whether Ruyer would. It seems like a consistent position would be to say that from the standpoint of an observer, equipotentiality can always be cashed out in more or less mechanistic terms, like in terms of physicochemical interactions. And that, it would just also be the case that for some forms, there's this other side that is an experience of the world. But yeah, I'm thinking now that Ruyer would maybe argue instead that the physicochemical kind of step-by-step causality explanation can't fully explain things like detour behavior, for instance, and that it's because of the explanatory gap, I guess, can be a sign maybe that the object being studied is a primary consciousness rather than a machine, for instance.
Yeah, I think that's an important element to bring up, because I think so. He doesn't want to say that this primary consciousness is like an extra thing added on, that sort of, there would be certain things that are mechanical processes or these sort of processes that can be explained in these sort of straightforward physical terms, and then certain other processes have like an extra thing, this primary consciousness that is sort of added on, that because then you get to this bizarre problem of like, how does this primary consciousness interact with physical properties and sort of bring about events that happen in the world. You're sort of still at that like pineal gland problem of like, does the mitochondria have like a pineal gland where the mitochondria consciousness interacts with the ATP molecule or whatever. It's this bizarre kind of question, and yeah, it's probably a sign that something has gone wrong in the sort of explanation you're trying to give, if you are sort of led to this problem of like, how do these sort of ghostly primary consciousnesses interact with the physical entities that you're sort of dealing with. So it's not the case that there are physical things going on, and then accompanying some of these physical things, there's this primary consciousness that somehow interacts with them and makes them do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. So what I think he's trying to get at here is that, or sorry, maybe to back up a bit. So any of these phenomena that we do describe in terms of finalism, like the embryo that regularly develops into the tadpole despite these disturbances, each of the sort of occurrences in this embryo are of course physical events that are brought about through physical causes, like there's always these chemicals in the embryo that sort of trigger certain events to happen in the developmental process and so on. But the sort of overall arrangement of all these different physical events and processes is not itself a physical event or process. And I think maybe here, like, this distinction between true forms and aggregates is useful here, because a machine is essentially an aggregate that is arranged in accordance with some sort of finality. And so like in the cybernetics book, he talks about pipes. He sort of uses this term pipe in a very like abstract sense. And so like the sort of concrete sense of a pipe, of course, is that it's a tube that allows some sort of aggregate like water or sand or whatever it is to or that ensures that the development of the progression of this aggregate through time is restricted to a certain region of its configuration space. So like a bunch of water without a pipe would just sort of flow in all directions. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? On my end, it shows voice connected. It has like all green. Organelles, are you hearing me okay?
I hear you just fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it might be on your end.
Okay. Yeah, it might be VPN.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so this concept of a pipe essentially is like a constraining of the possible evolution through time of an aggregate. So you have like a tank full of water, and then you sort of like you imagine this like water tank is elevated, it's up on a pole or whatever, and you pull the plug out at the bottom, the water is just going to pour out everywhere and probably make a big mess. If you instead have a tube, that sort of leads from the drain of the tank to, I don't know, another tank or whatever, or a swimming pool, whatever it is, and then you sort of remove this plug, then the water will not just pour out everywhere, but will be constrained by the tube to flow in a certain direction into the swimming pool, for example. And this is sort of like for Ruyer, this is like the sort of general structure of a machine, is that you have these aggregates of molecules or atoms or electrons, whatever it is, that without sort of further structure would just sort of follow their own patterns of interaction and do whatever they would normally do. But then the machine, like building a machine, is constraining the time evolution of these aggregates to follow a certain pattern that brings about a result of whatever kind. It could be a very simple thing like water going into the pool rather than dumping out on the ground. And yeah, so the sort of process through which the water is made to go from the tank into the pool is itself obviously a physical process. The pipe is a piece of, I don't know, PVC or whatever, that interacts with the water molecules in such a way that the water molecules flow down the pipe into the pool. This is all very straightforward physical processes, but of course the building the water pouring machine is not something that just sort of spontaneously happens as a result of PVC, like, I don't know, interacting with water and like sort of bringing about an arrangement in which the water flows down the tube into the pool. It's something that a person who has a goal in mind of filling the swimming pool has to sort of decide to put the pipe in the right orientation that will make the water flow in that way. And so the person is sort of responding to some sort of value of, like, I don't know, I want to have water in my swimming pool so I can swim, and is also sort of aware of the properties of water and pipes and so on, and uses that awareness to achieve a goal. In the case of the embryo, of course, the embryo is not aware in the sense of in the same way a human is not aware of, say, the properties of its own chemical constituents and so on. It's not sort of like deciding in that sense of I'm going to use my left leg formation region as a right leg formation region after this intervention. But it's doing something analogous to that sort of process, in the sense that it is sort of making all the sort of constituent molecules that make up that embryo. It's using those molecules. It's directing their time evolution in such a way that it results in the formation of a right leg. And so, yeah, so a machine is this kind of constraining of the time evolution of other entities in such a way as to bring about a goal. But that set of constraints is not itself, or like the arrangement of those constraints is not itself a physical entity that is sort of making the system as a whole sort of adopt a certain arrangement. It's not the PVC pipe and the water tank that are sort of making themselves take on the arrangement of putting the water in the pool.
Yeah, I know this is where the book is going, but as I'm listening to everything, I'm always thinking, okay, well, if I was being my most skeptical, what would I be saying? And just being kind of a jackass skeptic, you might just say, I mean, like the criticism could just fall at the level of just basic cause and effect and all of this, this step by step cause and effect, which he'll go on to show that this is all happening, maybe not within that particular cause effect spatiotemporal realm. So for me, what I have to keep in mind is that his concept here, this that what we're calling consciousness right now, I guess, which again, that term is so loaded, but equipotentiality, all of these things, that it's functioning within this broader, what he calls sense, SENS framework. I don't know, I just to kind of keep it grounded within that concept of his.
Yeah, there's a helpful sort of ambiguity of the word sens in French here, because it means, yeah, sense, in the way that in English we would say that this makes sense, or the sense of this word is X. Um, and it also means direction, in the sense of like heading north. It is a certain is a direction. And so I think he's going to like he's kind of playing on that ambiguity, because he's treating meaningfulness as a kind of direction in like a space of meaning, if you want to put it in those terms. So like the embryo is sort of directed toward, has a direction in the sort of overall, I don't know, configuration space of what the embryo could do. It is sort of selecting a direction that leads towards this normal looking tadpole. And this is, at the same time, a kind of meaningfulness of what it's doing, rather than a very mechanical sort of one state being produced by a previous state. So yeah, the ambiguity is in French, or the fact that this word sens has a broader meaning or different meanings than the English word sense. It's helpful for his point about equipotentiality here. And then maybe even a third meaning. I mean, they're all sort of related, but sens, like sense in English, we also use the word sens for like the sense of smell, or the sense of vision, whatever. So also the embryo is it has senses in that sense, not in the way that the embryo is not sort of like looking at a blueprint that says here's what a tadpole looks like, but it is sort of aiming at the tadpole, the sort of tadpole design or form or whatever. It is still sort of responsive to that tadpole design, something in something like a way that we can sort of picture it, like looking at a goal and trying to reach that goal. But of course, yeah, the danger here is to sort of like, yeah, imagine that the embryo has a sort of blueprint in front of it that it's looking at, and then sort of comparing itself to and saying, oh, I should have a right leg here instead of a left leg, which of course is not anything like what is actually happening. But yeah, you can. Before we started recording, I mentioned briefly the Plotinus's Ennead about contemplation and nature, and so he's talking about how natural entities, like a tadpole or whatever, are contemplations, as opposed to having contemplation. So the tadpole is not sort of contemplating the one, but it is a contemplation of the one. And so likewise, you could say that the embryo here for Ruyer is not sort of contemplating the tadpole. It's not looking at a tadpole blueprint and saying, here's what a tadpole looks like. But it is, in some sense, a directedness towards the tadpole. It's as if it's sort of like contemplating the tadpole form, or sorry, it is a contemplation of the tadpole form, as opposed to sort of being outside that tadpole form and looking at that tadpole form and sort of using that representation of the tadpole as like a sort of blueprint that it works off of. So yeah, it's sense in a third sort of meaning of that word, in the sense of like perception, or here contemplation. So the tadpole, this true form, is a contemplation of itself. It's this sort of absolute survey of itself, but and it's also this directedness through the configuration space of everything that the embryo could do, and it's also meaning. So all these different meanings of sens are all at work at the same time. Yeah, so we've spent a long time on this one passage, but I think it's an important passage because it sort of brings together a lot of these different points that he's been coming at it from different angles throughout the book. So we are at a chapter break. I don't know if we want to go on to the next chapter here at this point, or stop here for today. What it is both of you think?
This next chapter, it also starts starts off running. I mean, there's not a really good like stopping point early on, in my opinion. I mean, maybe we could preview it a little bit, or I don't know, or we could read the very first part and like leave it hanging for next week. I don't know. I'm open.
Yeah, Angus, what do you think?
Yeah, maybe we could read just the first page or so of the next chapter, before he goes into this list of different consciousness observer couplings.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, Organelles, do you want to read the first page up till the letter A, like subheading
Yeah,
or itemized
yeah,
list, I
sure.
guess? Thanks.
Sure, sounds good. This last paragraph ends with a bit of a banger here too, so this is good. Okay, so chapter 8, the reciprocal illusion of incarnation and quote unquote material existence. The examination of the facts forces us to rethink the Cartesian break between a thinking soul and a mechanical body. The opposition, as it emerges from recent observations and experiments, is instead between 1. The organism as a set of tools or a set of organs insofar as they are tools, and 2. Consciousness, primary or secondary, organic or cerebral, that assembles multiple elements in such a way as to turn them into quote unquote amboceptors in a causal chain, and that thematically oversees the operation of organic machines, regulates them in case of lesion or failure, and thus gives to organic structures the property of equipotentiality. This dualism, as different as it may be from the Cartesian variety, is still a dualism and seems to pose the same problem that tormented Descartes' successors. How can two types of existence, as heterogeneous as consciousness and the body, be ultimately joined together in the unity of the living being? Up to now, we took it upon ourselves to pass ceaselessly from the perspective of consciousness and the subject to the perspective of the body and the object. We have to justify these passages by rediscovering unity, or a certain unity. It often happens in the history of the sciences that a problem that at one point appeared insoluble seems to solve itself. Such is the case here. The solution was discovered several decades ago by many authors, and we attempted to formulate it precisely in an earlier text. He refers to his book La Conscience et la Cour, 1937. Hymens, whose metaphysical works we will set aside, had expanded it with perfect clarity in various articles. These are gathered in Gesammelte Kleine Schriften, 1927. But he committed a gross error that we will come back to. On the other hand, in the particular domain of psychiatry, Adolf Meyer had protested for a long time against the abrupt distinction between body and mind, somatic theories and psychological theories in mental medicine, and called for psychosomatic medicine. This solution can be formulated in a few words. The problem posed by the duality of consciousness and the body, consciousness organism, and body organism, is illusory for the excellent reason that there is no body. The quote unquote body is the byproduct of the perception of a being by another being. The perceived being is perceived by definition as an object in the etymological sense of the term. It appears as independent of the observer, and this leads him to substantialize it.
Now recording.
Not hearing you. Yeah, I think there's a connection issue. I don't know what exactly happened. Can you try again now? Yeah, you cut out. Yeah, not hearing you now either.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, so I think it's just organelles that there's a connection issue.